Hello, everyone. Welcome this morning or afternoon or whatever you are. My name is Claudio Filho, and I'm very happy to be here today to present you the Spirit Talk series promoted by the United States Spiritist Federation. And that happens every Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm very happy to host this talk or to host this presentation, but our presenter for the day is Peter Hayes. And Peter is a worker at the Spirits Group of Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey. He's also the current outreach director of the United States Spiritist Federation and an active participant in the Tri-State Spiritist Federation. Peter has published several children's books with his wife, Beti Rozen, through their company Sem Fronteiras Press and other publishers in Brazil, Colombia, and the US. Having a long background in theater, he holds an MFA in dramatic writing from New York University and currently works in commercial real estate. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Claudio. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and I would like to make some brief announcements here. There's a new podcast-like series, Psychology and Spirituality, a bridge to a better life based on the works by Joanna de Angelis. And we have a new episode every Friday at 7 p.m. The Psychology and Spirituality weekly talks are based on the works of Joanna de Angelis and always offer a safe space to confront, compare, correlate, and expand spirituality concepts from a psychological lens, bringing insight, actionable tips, and real-world advice to help you lead a better life. The other thing, it should be coming up right now. There's a QR code, so if you want to help USSF produce more publications and promote Spiritism to everyone, please scan the QR code on the screen and help us with your donation. So let's go back now to Peter. And Peter, it's very good to have you here today. I think without further ado, please take it away and join us. I'm very excited to see what you are going to bring us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudio. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to the United States Spiritist Federation for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about the book, or a lot of what I'm saying today is based on the book Self-Discovery and Inner Search by Joanna de Angelis. And as Claudio mentioned, this book is also included among the several books that are part of the Psychology and Spirituality series that are happening on Friday evenings. What I'm going to say is kind of a basic, it's not even a full overview of the book per se, it's rather just going to touch on some points in the book. This book, Self-Discovery, is a very dense book, and there's a lot that one could cover in it. So it's not possible in the time that I have to do it all. But anything I say today may or may not be also overlapped in some way in the Psychology and Spirituality series. And if that happens, that would be great. But it's a wonderful series, very engaging, very nice, informative discussion about multiple works by Joanna de Angelis. And I encourage all of you to watch that series. So, in the book Self-Discovery and Inner Search by Joanna de Angelis, needless to say, psychology is essential in terms of helping us to overcome many of the problems that we have. It is extremely beneficial, and I would never hesitate to recommend therapy for anyone who feels they needs it. Joanna de Angelis acknowledges the importance of psychology, and certainly she embraces psychology a great deal. But in this book, Self-Discovery, she also makes a general point, which is that we cannot ignore an individual's level of spiritual evolution that we have a spirit that is subject to reincarnation. I think she says this because in traditional psychology, one does not necessarily acknowledge the existence of a separate spirit or in reincarnation, and that we're more our very being is more the workings of our brain and our physical existence. But here's what she says. I'm going to read a quote. One cannot overlook the generating causes of behavioral disturbances as traditionally accepted by psychological sciences. That's because it's been verified through evidence and study. However, she says, one cannot disregard the causes of a spiritual nature that are present in the patient's life due to the reincarnation process. In addition, the discarnate spirit may tune in to the patient's vibration due in virtue to their past wrongs. So Joanna de Angelis is saying that we are certainly subject to a lot of the difficulties that psychology has been able to define for us, but also because we have a spirit, we're part of an evolutionary process that goes well beyond a single lifetime. And it's very important for us to understand this and embrace it in order to have a better idea of who we are. This is, of course, a big debate. What is our real existence? Physical, spiritual, both? How do we understand that? It's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm talking about today to get into that subject. But regardless of our attitudes about our physical and spiritual existence, this book emphasizes that searching inward and understanding who we are is also essential. She says, Joanna de Angelis does, the experience of self-discovery allows the individual to identify their limits and dependencies, his true and false aspirations, ego tricks, and impostures of illusions. So what she's saying is that self-discovery is about looking inward, an inner search, and that we try to recognize what we're dependent on, what our weaknesses are, but also our true and false aspirations. Are we seeing things clearly? Do we have a clear perception of reality or ourselves and our agendas? Do we have a clear understanding of what matters to us and what's really important? Or are we working under some kind of distortion or illusion? There's ego tricks. Well, the ego is very important in terms of our development, but when our ego becomes distorted, then that can get us into a lot of trouble. And she mentions impostures of illusions, again, a type of distortion. But by looking inward, you could say that self-discovery is about purpose and being clear about our purpose, that our purpose through psychology is to do our best to recognize and overcome the distortions that we internalize. That is, distortions that we've relied upon to define who we are. I should say define who we are at the moment. So then the next question, which this book tries to address, is how do we overcome the distortions that we have about ourselves, about the world around us, etc. In a word, consciousness. Consciousness and having consciousness is a major theme of this book. Not just this book, but really all of the Joanna de Angelis books, one way or another, touch on the importance of consciousness. She says, and I quote, in a rational view, one feels a pressing need for self-discovery to favor recuperation when one is in a state of disharmony or growth, when one is a carrier of latent intrinsic values. So self-discovery is essential. It helps us to recuperate. It's like a life preserver, if you will, because we're often in a state of disharmony within our lives in some way, in some capacity. And that self-discovery is able to help us bring out our latent intrinsic values. It's a little bit like what Jesus says in terms of describing the soul, the spirit, as being like a seed, that the seed has the potential one day to be a tree. The implication of that is that our spirits, we have all of the equipment that we need to be our deeper, more fully realized selves, even if we're not there at the moment. But can it be brought out? And how is it going to be brought out? In a word, self-discovery, by making an effort to really look inward. Joanna de Angelis also says, quote, while the individual is not conscious of their possibilities, he stuns himself in destructive conflicts or runs away into striking depressive states, diving into psychoses of various orders that dominate him and make his own evolution momentarily impracticable. This is very important, because what she's saying is we have to have consciousness about who we are. We have to make an effort to go inward, because if we don't, we're going to get stuck in a variety of different conflicts, which she describes as being destructive. So we get ourselves into a big rabbit hole, so to speak. And sometimes when life is overwhelming because we're stuck in all these conflicts, our reaction to it is to become depressed and to try to escape, isolate ourselves, and so forth. Or as she puts it, we dive into some kind of psychosis. And therefore, these experiences, these states of being, can be very debilitating if we are not looking inward and making an effort to do so. But also, she points out, since she emphasizes spiritual evolution, it's impossible to continue on our spiritual evolution without consciousness. In many of our internal struggles, we certainly have distortions about our external and internal reality, and that we struggle to recognize who we really are and what we're capable of becoming. So the book focuses on identifying behaviors, tendencies we have that one could describe as distortions. Chapters 8, 9, and 10. Chapter 8 is soul killers, chapter 9, mental afflictions, and chapter 10, disturbing contents. And what I'm going to do is just pull out a few of these behaviors, tendencies that we have, and then try to say a few comments about them. But there are, of course, many others in the book as well. She mentions, for instance, our relationship to our past and vagueness that we may have about our future. Joanna de Angelis describes our past, or says that our past is often negative and neuroticizing, that one could add that these behaviors are really unavoidable in our earlier stages. In other words, we're born simple and ignorant, as the Spiritist codification says. So how can we not be negative in our past actions, have engaged in all kinds of negative behaviors and activities? It's pretty much impossible to avoid. And needless to say, we can often engage in behavior that's very neurotic. But what she's saying to us is that when we look at our past and we see the mistakes we've made, the things we did, the things we haven't done, and so forth, in doing so, we're not expected to start wallowing in judgment and lots of criticism about who we are and, oh my God, I'm such a terrible person and all that, because that's not the point. Rather, what Joanna de Angelis is saying is it's a time for us to reflect about our past and be in the moment about it. She says, quote, a tranquil analysis of the unfortunate occurrences awakes consciousness to find the means to diminish their consequences. So when we engage in a more tranquil analysis, we are slowing down and we're making an effort to look at our past behavior more objectively without, we may feel badly about it, of course, but we're not expected to go on and on and on wailing in judgment and criticism, because we cannot undo what has been done. So it's better that we learn to let it go and learn to forgive. She says, self-forgiveness is a necessity that enlightens the fault, which does not imply in believing in the wrongdoing or justifying the unfortunate action. It means to give oneself opportunity for inner growth, to repair damages, to accept one's own self-structure that must be fortified. So when we attempt to forgive ourselves, and we need to be able to do this, we're trying to pay attention to the faults that we have, shine a light on them, if you will, but that doesn't mean that we make excuses. We don't somehow believe that what we did was somehow right, and we don't try to justify it in some way. We have to be honest about it. But of course, it doesn't mean we beat up on ourselves endlessly either, because that misses the point. Rather, what she's saying is that when we can look at ourselves more objectively, that we're able to repair the damages that we may have caused or we feel that we have within ourselves. And in doing that, this strengthens our self-structure, is how she put it. So what's our self-structure? Our self-structure, you can look at it this way. If we look at our very being, who we are at the moment, how we're constructed, so to speak, what is our personality? What are our tendencies? What are our strengths, our weaknesses, and so forth? That's our self-structure. And it's going to change. We evolve, we change, we bring out what is within us that may be latent at the moment. But we fortify that self-structure by making an honest inward search as to what we need to work on. So not only are we looking inward, but one way to fortify our inner selves is to try to visualize a change, to try to imagine what we could do differently from this point on. Well, in order to visualize changes, that means that we really have to slow down and take time to reflect. How often are many of us often moving around, very busy in the moment, charging ahead, doing this and doing that? Lord knows I've been guilty of that. And it prevents us from really taking the time to stop, slow down, and really reflect on not only what we've done, what we're doing at the moment, but also where we would like to try to go in the future, to the extent that we can influence that. But when we reflect objectively on our past, it will, of course, affect our future as well. Likewise, or on the contrary, if we obsess and feel that our past was just full of problems and we really messed up, then it's very likely our future is going to be full of problems too, because we haven't really changed our mindset about how we look at ourselves and look at who we are. It's better to worry less about the past and the future and all of the imagined consequences of each, and just learn to be in the moment. Being in the moment, which is often talked about in spirituality as a whole, is very important, because Joanna de Angelis emphasizes that the past is past, the future will soon come into the present, and then it too will be past. So worrying excessively about the past, either obsessing about the past or obsessing about the future, not only makes us very stressed and creates a lot of imbalance and a lack of harmony, but it also misses the point. When we're in the moment, we're in the here and now, and we're engaged where we are at the moment, and we focus on what we're doing, we're paying closer attention to it, then we can really work on making changes now that will have an effect on our future down the road. She mentions, Joanna de Angelis does, that Jesus is the unique psychotherapist, is how she puts it, and that his advice for establishing peace from within is something like this: do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Again, Jesus is advising that we just simply be in the here and now, because tomorrow will get here when it gets here. Put another way, we cannot control what cannot be controlled. Now, that may sound a little bit like a Yogi Berra moment. If you know Yogi Berra, he was a baseball player, catcher, and he was famous for sayings like, "It ain't over until it's over," which is a nice way of thinking about life when people are always worried about, oh my God, what's going to happen next? How are we going to get through this moment we're in? Well, it ain't over until it's over. Likewise, we cannot control what we cannot control, so to speak. But it also reminds me of the serenity prayer. The serenity prayer goes like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Another area, a type of distortion that we can have, is when we simply are not very familiar with ourselves. And Joanna de Angelis talks about this as well. She says, not knowing who we are can make us vulnerable. And yet, when we think about that, it's so easy to happen. Here's a quote from her: "The individual neglects oneself and gives exacerbated importance to worries such as others' opinions, appearance and acquisition of material things, social living and insignificant disputes. Thus, one remains ignorant of one's true reality and one's latent potential." How often do we get tied up in knots when we think about, what do others think about me? What does so-and-so, this person I know, think about me? Well, do we know what that person really thinks about us? Or are we making assumptions about what that person thinks of us? This can get us into a lot of trouble. What if we are fixated on our physical appearance, or we're worried about acquiring material things because we think this is really what defines who we are? Or if we're worried about our social status, well, how much we make for a living, our economic status, does this really define who we are? Or what about insignificant disputes, petty, dumb arguments that we may get really worked up about? Joanna de Angelis is pointing out, without saying it directly, that all of these things are what? Temporary. They are not going to stay with us. So when we're fixating on all these supposedly important moments that are not permanent to begin with, then that's how we stay in ignorance. And we don't have a sense of our true reality. And we're also ignoring, as she puts it, our latent potential. Again, the analogy of the soul, the spirit, being like a seed that is slowly but surely unfolding and beginning to realize itself over time. Well, how can we connect to our latent potential, our deeper talents and abilities, if we're focusing on stuff that is either a distortion or really not that important? But also, if we go back to, say, worrying about what other people think of us, that's when, if we keep judging ourselves and imagining, oh, so-and-so doesn't like me, they all think I'm bad, I'm terrible, etc., then our self-esteem starts to plummet. And we, of course, get pulled in many directions. And we may find that life, when we experience it this way, becomes very challenging, frustrating, overwhelming, and it just makes us want to give up. Joanna de Angelis acknowledges those impulses. She understands. But also, she points out that trying to avoid conflicts and the conditions imposed on us by life, it won't work. None of us can avoid a variety of changes. She says there are distressing illnesses. Everyone is likely to encounter that at some point. There's arduous circumstances. Everyone goes through that one way or another. And it is just the way life is. And it's because we live a temporary existence on Earth. The Earth is fragile. We are fragile. The natural state of life here is decay and impermanence. Now, okay, that may sound really depressing, but it's not meant to be. It just means that we are passing through this time and that we're trying to avoid, we're trying not to hang on to the things that we cannot really hang on to in the first place. Well, you may say that's kind of obvious, and I would agree with you, but nevertheless, how often are we trying to hang on to things and we think we can hang on to them, but we can't? And it may be obvious to somebody else, but it's not obvious to us. But another point of all of this is that everything that we have in our physical existence, it comes from God and it's on loan. Therefore, trying to hang on to it is a fallacy. Yes, life is hard in many ways. But when we examine ourselves, Joanna de Angelis advises us that we avoid the harmful habit of self-pity. Instead, again, we need to be objective. Of course, we can get very frustrated, but if we're going to fixate and feel sorry for ourselves, she basically is telling us to buck up, so to speak, and not get into that trap. That when we look at our own emotional fragility and emotional resistances objectively, that's how we fortify ourselves. She says self-discovery requires humility before life without a degrading posture because it provides the illumination of love from the self's center that is conscious of its reality and divine origin. So when we look at ourselves, examine ourselves, and we learn how to be humble, I'll try to say more about that later on, we are again being objective. We're not denigrating ourselves in some way. And that allows the illumination of love, self-love, to come from our deeper selves, our higher selves. And that makes, and the more we become conscious of that, the more we acknowledge the difficulties that we're going through at the moment. But then we're also acknowledging that we are able to get through them somehow. And when we can do that, then we are connecting to a more divine, an origin that's divine in nature. In other words, it comes from God. Another distortion that we can get hung up with that Joanna de Angelis talks about is dissatisfaction. In other words, dissatisfaction with our lives. To avoid dissatisfaction, she suggests that we must reprogram the mind, as she puts it. She puts it like this: automatisms can take place in circumstances such as long-maintained habits, addictions of all forms maintained for a long time, psychological accommodations to events, and attitudes justified by the ego's mechanisms of evasion. So, what is an automatism? Well, an automatism is a physical function like the organs of our body. And they can be physical functions in which we don't really notice what's going on. And in this case, the word automatism gets used a lot in Joanna de Angelis's work. We have emotional automatisms in which we're engaging in various behaviors, habits, long-maintained habits, as she puts it, without really paying much attention to them. We just do them automatically. Addiction could be another one of some kind. And what then occurs is that we get into these predicaments of accommodating all kinds of behaviors and attitudes, and we use our ego to justify that, but it's really a big form of avoidance. And that's one of the points she's making here. So we have to be aware of it. Again, consciousness, big theme of this book. And she puts it that we need to reprogram the mind. We need to pay more attention and then try to make adjustments. Well, reprogramming the mind, that might sound a little scary. It might imply hypnosis or some kind of mind control. And that's, has negative connotations, but that's not what she's getting at. Rather, she's talking about us learning to expand our mental field, and that the more we expand our mental field, that means we move beyond merely fixating on ourselves, our own worries, our own obsessions, and our own projections of others, and so forth. That in general, it's very easy for us to get stuck in habits in which we project our distortions onto others. And this can make us very fed up. It can make us want to escape because we feel dissatisfied. By the way, what is a projection? Projection is kind of a psychological term, and that often happens when we don't really trust ourselves or respect ourselves, or we're very insecure, have low self-esteem. Again, I mentioned before about the opinions of others. Well, do we really know what somebody thinks of us? Suppose we don't, but we think we do. That's a projection. I have a political view in which I'm going to rant and rave at the world about this, that, and the other. Do I really have an opinion that's based on reality and facts, or am I just projecting my perspective onto the world because I'm angry or upset about something? So projections are, again, us making assumptions about the intentions of others, or what a situation is, without really knowing for sure what it really is. Joanna de Angelis says that when this urge to retreat happens, that is, if we make assumptions about other people's opinions of us, for instance, and we become very dissatisfied, we may want to give up and just get out of a situation. And she says, when this urge to retreat happens, the individual thinks of traveling, changing jobs, terminating marriage or getting married, and depending on the case, changing social relationships. So if we have a distorted perception, and that distorted perception has led to us feeling very dissatisfied with ourselves, well, it's happened in part because we haven't gone inward. We're having an external perspective on the way things are. We're not looking inward. And our solution at that moment is, okay, I'm going to change my job. Then everything will be fine. I'm going to get out of this marriage because I know it's never going to work. And my life will be better when I'm single, or I marry somebody, and then my life will be better. Or I'm going to change the relationships I currently have. It doesn't mean that sometimes those things aren't important, and maybe we do need to do those things. But if we're doing them because we're really dissatisfied and we haven't taken the time to really look inward and be more objective about what we're going through and how we are processing it, if we don't do all that stuff and we just make a change for the sake of making a change, then we're going to perpetuate the dissatisfaction. How often do people, for instance, get out of one relationship, go into another relationship, and kind of do similar things in that relationship that they did in the first relationship because they didn't change? I think that happens a lot. So when we feel dissatisfied, again, we have to go inward. Just give me a second here. Joanna de Angelis also talks about another type of distortion, which would be indifference. Another word for indifference would be depression. And when we feel indifferent, it can just feel like progress in our lives is practically impossible. Joanna de Angelis puts it like this: in depressive states, apathy often manifests, dominating the person's emotional landscapes. Apathy hinders the achievement of habitual activities and kills the interest to any objective. It is a stormy indifference that isolates little by little the patient from the objective world, alienating one. So depression can be very debilitating. If we feel apathetic, we don't really feel motivated to do much of anything. As she says, It hinders our habitual activities. And it kills our interest to have any objective in life. We just don't want to move forward. We feel stuck. And this kind of indifference, she describes it as a stormy indifference. And one of the things that can happen is as we become indifferent, we want to isolate ourselves. And this just makes it worse. It really is like being in, like we've dug a big hole in the ground and we're in the hole and now we can't get out of it. And what's also happening if we isolate ourselves due to depression is that our sense of the objective world becomes kind of lost, really. And this can happen for a few reasons, but one of the things that can cause it is that we simply have a more egocentric view of things, and that we're not able to really rise above looking at the world beyond our own selves. I'll say a little bit more about egocentric behavior in a moment, but what do we do about feeling indifferent and feeling apathetic? Well, Joanna de Angelis has another book called A Sowing of Love. And in that book is chapter 28, which is called Serve More. And why we feel apathetic, well, there may be lots of reasons, but one of them might be immaturity. We're feeling sorry for ourselves. We're not able to somehow make things work. And part of what Joanna de Angelis says in this chapter 28, Serve More, from A Sowing to Love, is if we're feeling down in the dumps and we're feeling overwhelmed, etc., then we need to, as I'm going to be blunt about it, she basically says stop whining and work and serve more. That work, the dignifying, here she puts it this way, the dignifying work that you do in service to others becomes a safe harbor for your troubled heart. In other words, we find a new activity to engage ourselves in, an activity that's worthwhile, is edifying, is helping others, and we put our focus there. Because when we feel apathetic, indifferent, we're in depression, we're kind of caught in our own world of the self. And I don't mean to minimize the effects of that. It's a very debilitating depression, and I'm only touching on a couple of quick points about this here. But what Joanna de Angelis is suggesting is that we find ways to get involved in an active, positive pursuit that can channel our focus in a different way. In this chapter 28, Serve More, from A Sowing of Love, she also mentions this: work is life, and service applied toward edification is the main beam supporting your happiness. So if you think of work and the activity of doing that and working with a purpose, helping others in some way, and being involved in a positive activity like that, it creates like a beam. If you imagine our happiness as being like the roof, and then the beams are supporting that roof. I'm going to start to wind down bit by bit here by focusing on another area that Joanna de Angelis talks about, which is anger. And it, again, our relationship to anger, depending upon what's going on there, can be another type of distortion that can cause a lot of disharmony within us. But she also makes a very important point. Getting angry at times is certainly normal. It helps us to diffuse tensions that we need to free ourselves. Sometimes maybe people in spiritist circles may feel like, oh, we can never get angry, we must elevate our thoughts at all time, we must be, serene and peaceful. Well, that's true in many ways. We don't want to go around yelling at everybody all the time. But if we are being peaceful and serene and not connecting to anger that we really have, then we're getting ourselves into some trouble there. Joanna de Angelis suggests 4 general approaches to anger that we should avoid. I just alluded to the first one, which is number one would be that we are disguising anger and keeping it intact. So if we have anger and we don't acknowledge it in some way, then all we're doing is just keeping that anger alive and well. And it will come back and cause all kinds of difficulties for us, which I'll get to in a minute. The second thing we should avoid, she says, is the implications of its damages by repeatedly going over the cause that generated it. Okay, we're clear about a situation or a person that made us angry, some event that happened, during our day. It's one thing to spend some time looking at it, focusing on it. It's another thing to keep fixating on it over and over and over and over again, kind of replaying this recording in our head of this incident and how angry it makes us. Well, that becomes a loop, and Joanna de Angelis is saying and hinting that it's a big trap. The third thing we should avoid, she says, is feeling self-pity and feeling like we're the victim. Well, if we're angry about something and then we lapse into self-pity or we feel like we're the victims, we're basically saying everybody is out to get me, life is unfair, I'm being treated badly, etc. And what we're not doing is looking at how we're processing the anger that we're experiencing. We're putting our perceptions of the problem, that we're making them external, and we're not looking inward. Sometimes when we're full of self-pity or we feel like we're the victim in a situation, that's when we start rationalizing, and ultimately what it's about is we're avoiding responsibility. Maybe we're angry about a situation. Did we do anything to provoke it? Did we provoke somebody? Do we realize when we provoke people? People provoke each other all the time. But how often do people notice it? What? I did that? What do you mean? Oh, no, I didn't do that. That kind of thing. Sometimes we don't realize we're provoking others, or others are provoking us. And sometimes we do realize we're provoking others and we do it on purpose. But regardless of that, how are we, what role are we playing in creating a moment that is creating anger? And do we attract it? The fourth approach to anger that Joanna de Angelis suggests that we avoid is the desire of revenge by being aggressive and taking advantage of an antagonist's weakness and suffering. This one's pretty self-explanatory. If we want to get revenge on somebody, we want retribution, retaliation, and so forth. Well, history is full of tribal warfares, countries having endless wars with each other, people having animosity and aggression towards each other that can go on not only over and over again in a single lifetime, but multiple lifetimes. It never stops when we go down that path. That's the point. And if we have, say, the upper hand on somebody, and then we want to take advantage of somebody's weakness, that's basically a desire to get even by kicking somebody when they're down, so to speak. And this type of revenge, it's going to come back. You think how can we do that to somebody and not have it come back down the road in some way? Also about anger, Joanna de Angelis strongly emphasizes that we must be careful about the effects of anger on our health, that frequent anger can affect us by affecting the vagus nerve in the brain. What is a vagus nerve? Vagus nerve controls many of the critical bodily functions within us, our bodies, such as our heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, and digestion. And anger can affect those functions, and it can also create things like indigestion, diarrhea, acid reflux, abnormal irregular heartbeats, a lack of appetite, or gluttony. So you see, our body may react in a variety of ways that are due to anger. It may be anger that we're aware of because we frequently get angry, or maybe we are not connecting to our anger, we're internalizing the anger, and then it comes out in other ways through difficulties with our physical health. She emphasizes that we need to work first from within and resolve this anger and try to understand what are the causes of the anger in the first place. Again, consciousness, consciousness, consciousness. And that a person who is lucid and healthy will find ways to channel anger in ways that allow it to dissolve completely. So again, it's not that being angry is a terrible thing. Oh no, I can never get angry, I'm a spiritist, I'm too serene. That misses the point. Rather, if we acknowledge our anger, then we can begin to think about, how can I handle this anger? Do I need to find a way to either express it or confront the cause of the anger in some way that is not so aggressive, threatening, belligerent, and so forth? And this really also gets into the subject of forgiveness. Joanna de Angelis tells us, quote, when Jesus proposed forgiveness of offenses, he referred to the forgetfulness of them, which means the dilution of the lustral waters of love. By lustral, she means purification, waters of love. This strongly suggests that when we are trying to forgive, that we can only do that when we have more consciousness about how we're processing anger, how we experience it. And then as we develop more consciousness and awareness, we can then begin to let these things go bit by bit. And that's really what forgiveness is about. Forgiveness is about letting go. I don't want to go into the larger subject of forgiveness because that's a big topic unto itself, and we're short on time. But when we have more consciousness about ourselves in this way, about what makes us angry, then it's easier for us to have love in the first place. And the more we have a genuine sense of love, helped by consciousness, then it's easier to be able to forgive others. But in terms of how we handle anger, well, if we can, we should obviously try to communicate with somebody if they're the cause of our anger, and that when we find a gentle way to communicate, we can make sure and make it clear to people that if somebody is not treated us well, that we too deserve respect. There's a nice quote from Joanna de Angelis, which I think is very important, and it goes like this. One should never have a false, humble attitude by pretending sanctification before achieving full humanization. When one assumes an air of superiority without inwardly reaching that level, one will travel through a lot of conflicts, including that of inferiority, thereby advancing towards depressive states. So again, if we try to pretend that we're somehow humble, or we think we're humble because we've just sort of masked over a situation. Oh, it's fine, I'm not angry. Of course I'm not angry. I would never be angry. Why should I be angry about this? Well, there may be denial going on, and if that happens, then it makes it very difficult for us to really reach a state where true and genuine forgiveness is possible. That when we're trying to act as though we're above it all and somehow detached from it all, I would call it a type of false spirituality, so to speak, then we're kind of setting ourselves up for more conflicts as we move forward with life. And also, we may be generating a deeper sense of inferiority. Maybe we're turning ourselves into punching bags, so to speak, and that can invite more abuse from people, not less. So Again, when we communicate with people, we need to make it clear that we believe that we're entitled to respect and that we need to find a way to articulate that to somebody without attacking them at the same time. Also, Joanna de Angelis says, quote, humility is never the denial of one's own value, nor the underestimation of oneself by making deprecating caricatures of one's reality. Among many others, there are many blessings that cannot be despised, such as being a child of God's, being aware of one's evolutive experience, being able to discern, and other blessings. So what she's saying is that when we have genuine humility, it doesn't mean that we're taking ourselves for granted, that we believe that we are children of God, that this is something that is sacred, that we are all sacred, we are all important, we do have self-worth, and that we should acknowledge that and appreciate it. It's really a comment about the importance of having self-love, a genuine self-love for ourselves. That's not being egotistical or narcissistic. It is having a healthy amount of self-esteem that we all need in order to function. And that, when we have that, then it's much easier for us to be more loving and respectful of others. That she emphasizes that respect and love are the best resources to face anger, because we're not avoiding it, we're trying to find ways to confront it, but we're also not perpetuating it by being excessively aggressive, belligerent, etc. And in that process, we need to do our best to let go of any anger that we have and not retain it. And if we don't answer anger with additional attacks, then we don't wind up having sorrows later on. One final point that I want to make as I start to wrap up, and I said this at the beginning, I touched on a few distortions, and there are others that the book gets into. It's a very dense book. I think anyone who goes to a Spiritist center who is having difficulties of one kind, Spiritist centers can be wonderful places in which to help, but one should always seek out a professional and go to get professional therapy if one needs it. Talk therapy can be a wonderful way to receive help in terms of being able to allow ourselves to develop more consciousness and awareness. Very quickly, psychoanalysis, which was pretty much invented by Sigmund Freud, is a process of free association, and much of the point of psychoanalysis is to really allow ourselves to go wherever our mind is taking us and not censor what we're thinking. And part of the purpose of doing that is for us to understand our own negativity. And the more we understand our own negativity, the more that negativity is not going to push us around so much. And so it can help to free us. So to conclude and to wrap up here, the process of humanity, the progress of humanity really does depend on us rising above our own egocentrism and adopting a more world-centric view. The more that we learn to understand and be more sympathetic to one another's situations, the more compassion and tolerance can become the foundation of our existence. Much of the world is still kind of stuck in a more, from an egocentric perspective. What I mean by that, and this is a very quick comment, there's different levels of cognitive development, and we begin in a much more egocentric stance because we're born that way. Small children are egocentric by nature. A slightly more advanced form of egocentric behavior is something along the lines of, I'm right and everybody else is wrong. Maybe a slightly more advanced egocentric behavior beyond that is my group is right, my country's right, but the others are suspect and kind of for it. And much of the world, put very simply, is kind of more at that level, sizable amount of the world's population. But as we evolve more spiritually, we get into more advanced modes of thinking in which we begin to become more world-centric, not egocentric in our perspective. When we're world-centric, we realize that others really do matter. All of us matter. We start to look outward. Now, many people do this, of course. I'm not suggesting everybody's trapped in merely egocentric behavior. But the more and more humanity and people, the population proportions adapt so that more people adopt a more world-centric view, then that's when we'll start to really see changes in humanity. And we can do this, each of us can do this when we care about ourselves and we care about others as well. And one could say that it is our duty to be able to get to that point. And again, Self-Discovery and Inner Search by Joanna de Angelis, the main purpose, one of the major themes of that book is that consciousness matters and that we need to use consciousness to take responsibility for who we are. All of us can do this inner search. And when we do an inner search like that, it helps us to mature. Joanna de Angelis hints a great deal about psychological immaturity is often a root cause of difficulties and unhappiness that we often experience. And we have to do, but we don't have to remain immature. In fact, as we evolve spiritually, of course, it is about maturity. And finally, when we use consciousness and we make positive changes within ourselves, we can influence others to do the same. And as I mentioned before, that's how progress really begins to happen. But we have to go inward. We have to have the courage to do that inward search and not be afraid to acknowledge and face the things that we have not done well, because the world will not come to an end if we realize and confront the mistakes that we have made. In fact, the opposite will happen. Our world will begin to expand and open up, and we will begin to realize there are many ways of experiencing life that go well beyond the way we thought we had to experience life. Thank you very much for paying attention.
Thank you so much, Peter, for those great words of wisdom. Just before we conclude here our presentation today, I would like to ask you a couple of questions that we have received along the way on the presentation. Would you be okay with that?
Sure, I'll do my best to try to answer them.
Awesome. So yeah, we have the first question here on the screen. So for some people, Joanna de Angelis' books are very difficult to comprehend. I include that myself. I try to do that myself. They're very hard to read. So what is your suggestion to facilitate our understanding of her works? Or is there a sequence that you would recommend?
I would certainly recommend, whether you follow, I mean, it would be great to follow the books in sequence, but assuming one does not do that, I would strongly recommend studying the books as a group. It's always much more interesting with books like this, I think, to have a group of people. And forgive me for this shameless plug, but I do a Thursday night study group on Joanna de Angelis's books. I did one on family constellation, and I'm doing one now on the book Self-Discovery. And we go through it slowly, and we try to decipher those moments where the language can be difficult. The other thing I'll say is I think Joanna de Angelis's works can be challenging even in the original Portuguese. The English, sometimes it depends on the translation, and it depends on the book. Some books I think of hers are a little easier to understand than others. But to answer the question, I would say definitely get involved in a study group of some kind. There are several out there that I'm sure are quite good.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. Let's go for our next question here. So, this journey of self-discovery, it's a very painful journey. Anyone that really look inside and start to expose some
Mm-hmm.
of those things, it
Right.
really hurts you. So how can we smooth that journey? Can you give us a couple of tips there?
Well, certainly it can be very painful. There's nothing quite worse than for us to really confront ourselves and realize some of the things that we've done. Maybe we've hurt people very deeply and we've made major mistakes. But humility is key. And we have to be patient with ourselves. We have to be forgiving of ourselves and take our time. This is not about, I'm going to solve my problems by next week. So I would not recommend the pop psychology self-help approach in which we're looking for a quick fix. We need to take the time that it takes. We need to go as slowly and methodically as we need to. And how slow and how methodical? Well, it depends on the person. Everyone's different. Everyone processes things a little differently. I mean, what may be not a big deal to you may be a major deal to me. Uh, and that's my reality. So then I then have to focus on what it is that I'm reacting to and what it means for me and why is something so difficult for me to face. But the short answer is yes, it's painful, but we have to have the courage to try to do it. But we also have to be compassionate with ourselves. Always, always, always be compassionate with ourselves as we move through a process of self-discovery.
Yeah, the first step is really identifying
Yeah.
those those feelings and how you are inside. So if you're doing that, that's a great first step.
And it's not always very easy. I mean, I kept saying we need to have consciousness, and people may think, well, that's kind of obvious, and say yes, but at the same time, when we start to look at ourselves, it may not be so obvious. Maybe it's obvious to our people who are close to us, but it may not be obvious to us. And so we have to allow that time to sink in, so to speak, so that we can really identify and recognize what our habits are, how we process things, what we're doing, how we provoke other people, how maybe we're overly sensitive to things, and a variety of emotions that we go through.
Yeah, no, like what you said there, having this circle of trust around you also
Mm-hmm.
helps. And you have to be open to that because you
Yes.
cannot become defensive. So you have to be open to that feedback that comes from either your wife or your siblings or your friends. And once you do that, that helps. If you don't have the power to identify yourself, maybe other people can help you to figure that out.
Yeah, it's very important because if somebody tries to share something with us about us and we don't like it very much, it can feel painful and it may be very humiliating. But we also have to give ourselves time to acknowledge that, try to process it, and then go a little further. And
Yeah,
yeah.
great. Yeah, let's look at our next question here. So you made a point throughout the presentation that we shouldn't focus much on the future, but we should focus in the here and now. But
Hmm.
with everything that is happening, we hear about war, we had the pandemic. There's so many
Hmm.
different things coming that anxiety becomes a major problem for our society nowadays. So, do you have any suggestions, or maybe does Joanna de Angelis, on the
Hmm.
work that you have researched, does she point out any particular way to deal with that
Hmm.
anxiety and that feeling of, always like guessing for tomorrow?
One of the things that she recommends is certain habits that I think we're all familiar with. Meditation can be a good one, just taking the time to kind of slow down and be in the moment that way. Um, uh, Engaging in activities that are worthwhile to us, but also enjoyable, so it can channel our focus in a different way. That not using that to escape, but just give ourselves a break from time to time. And another would be certainly prayers can be very helpful. And as I mentioned, seeing a therapist, if, you know, and speaking of trust that you just mentioned, Claudio, it's important that we be in a therapeutic relationship in which we feel comfortable and safe, and we can be open up more and express what we're going through, and that it's not going to get used against us in some way or anything like that. As far as anxiety about the future, well, for instance, if we're worried about world events, what is our anxiety about, say, wars in other parts of the world going to do? I mean, are we going to stop the war that way?
No.
Right? Can we pray? Sure. Can we maybe find ways to support efforts that are sending relief efforts to those countries, providing medical assistance and things like that? Sure, we can, if we want to do that. But there are many things, which I was alluding to, there are many things that are simply not within our control. And being anxious about it doesn't help. So the more that we focus on what we do have control over, or at least the ability to change, such as ourselves, but also just engaging in activities within our own circle of existence, so to speak, then we can be more involved in activities that are about the present rather than obsessing about the future.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Thank you, Peter. Let's look at our next question here. Throughout the presentation, you mentioned that love covers a multitude of things. So in relation to self-discovery, how does that apply?
We all have the capacity to love, but our love can be covered up, so to speak, when we're kind of at the mercy of our own distortions. So the whole point of self-discovery is to try to recognize our distortions and then try to free ourselves of those distortions. The more we can free ourselves of distortions, the more we can begin to develop a more genuine and healthier relationship to love. So it's sometimes very difficult for us to express love freely and in a genuine, truly compassionate way if we're caught up in some kind of distortion about either ourselves or about others that interferes with that. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Okay. Thank you, Peter. So we have one more question before we move to our prayer.
Okay.
So this is very common. How can we deal with people that think that everything and everyone around them need to change, but they're not willing to change themselves? And I have to say, a lot of people, like they think that, but they, can you just go over that with us here?
Sure. Needless to, that can be infuriating when we're around people that basically are not willing to acknowledge that maybe they too play a role in creating the situation. It's like trying to deal with somebody who's a fanatic. Are you going to change the fanatic by arguing with them, reasoning with them? You could make the most articulate argument for what you believe in, and you may be totally right. But if somebody's very set in their ways, they just aren't going to hear it. So I would say in those situations, if they want to think that way, let them think that way, and we don't have to participate in that. So this gets into setting boundaries. It's a little bit like what Jesus said when he was advising the disciples about going out and preaching. If you go into a town and you're not well received and people don't want to hear it, shake the dust off your feet and keep going. go somewhere else. In other words, seek out a direction where you are listened to, you are respected. If we encounter people that simply don't want to change, I'm right, everybody else is wrong, we encounter that kind of stubborn behavior. What happens to them in the long run is going to be between them and God, so to speak. And if we can reason with them, we can try, but we shouldn't beat ourselves up and bang our heads against the wall, so to speak, trying to convince them to change, because we can't convince anybody to change if they don't want to change. That also includes, for instance, if you're in a situation where there's addiction, if you have either drug addiction in the household or alcoholism or something like that, then we really need to learn how to set boundaries with people, and we need to do our best to understand what we need to take care of our situation and not engage in behavior that's very toxic to us and destructive. And it may be hard to disengage from someone we care about and think, how in the world can I let this person, continue in this addiction? Well, obviously we should try to help people if we can, but if they don't want to receive help, there's not much we can do about it. And in the case of alcoholism, especially in drug addiction, there may be times where someone who's got an addiction like that has to hit rock bottom before maybe they will turn around. But unfortunately, that may not occur either. There may be, they may go the other way. So, but to answer the question, or kind of repeat myself a little bit, we can't change anyone who doesn't want to be changed. And it's not.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. From my own experience dealing with situations like that, I always try to set an example rather than talking to someone, because if they, especially if they're living with you or if they're close to you, they'll see what you do, and then it's like your children. So whatever you tell your children, they're not going to do it unless you do it, and they'll follow your example. So I do think that helps a little bit, but exactly like you said, if the person doesn't want to change, like that, nothing's really going to matter until they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one way to recognize who people are is to watch what they do, not what they say.
Exactly. Yeah. Peter, that was so great. Thank you so much for all the presentation and all the preparation that you did. We would like to remember everyone that this series of talks happen every Saturday morning. It starts at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Next week, we're going to have Alex Alves, and he's going to be talking about Salt of Earth, the light of the world. So I invite everyone that has joined us today, and I would also like to thank everyone that joined us today, that took the time to stop here and hear those words of wisdom from Peter. And Peter, would you like to close off conducting a prayer for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. If we're able to, let us take a moment to close our eyes. Dear God, thank you for giving us life. Thank you for giving us the potential to grow, to realize our deeper selves. May your light be within each and every one of us. May your light illuminate our journeys. And may we, in turn, illuminate our own journeys and do our best to be a positive inspiration to others, and therefore illuminate and be the light in other people's lives too. May all of us do our best to have honesty within ourselves, to be honest in our intentions, and to have goodwill and compassion toward everyone, knowing that this can be challenging at times. But may we do our best to have compassion for those who are closest to us especially, but to be compassionate and respectful to all that we encounter. And may we always do our best to be in harmony with the truth. Amen.